Francis of the Filth, Chapter 9. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. That lay him behind him. The future had now arrived. It was an innate knowledge that rose up within him, and he never doubted it. It sustained him on his brief crossing, and brought him a disposition, which he suspected might have been cheer. He sensed that by passing over this body of water, he was simultaneously passing over not just time, but history, not just space, but tears. His identity was reforming, his purpose consolidating. He could feel it in a fashion and with a certainty that he had never previously known, and it exhilarated him and scared him. The water gently lapped at the side of the raft as it twisted through the swell, occasionally spilling over the side and wetting his feet. He continued to work the oar, and as he did, the island loomed into view. It was considerably bigger than it had appeared from the shore, and it contained flatlands leading to a hill which rose grandly at the back. The nearer he drew, the more the mists lifted, and by the time he reached the shoreline of the island, the air was crisp and clear. He alighted into cool and fresh waters and dragged the raft high up onto the sands. Pausing to scan the landscape, he heard it again.
Frank!
The deep whisper rolled up to him like a gentle wave. It was the most inviting voice he had ever heard. He froze to catch it, and when it came again, he could tell it was emanating from the hill. Immediately, he set off for it. The plains he walked over were covered with a thick but soft green grass which swayed gently in the gusts blowing across it. Fat, twisted trees with thick caramel-colored bark, each producing a multitude of leaves of different colors and designs, dotted the terrain. In clusters around them, shrubs spawned flowers of the most vivid colors and shapes, while neighboring bushes grew fruits and seemingly unlimited variety. Frank noticed a little, if any, of this beauty. Such was his determination to reach the hill before sunset, yet his spirits couldn't but be lifted by the ambience that the landscape provided. He made good progress. With the sun ahead of him and still a fist above the pointed horizon, he stood at the base of the hill and peered up at it. Much of it appeared in silhouettes, yet he could identify everything clearly. Every piece of flora on the hill seemed to be arranged around a massive tree rising from its summit, as though an audience before it, as though in celebration of it. It rose into the sky like a tower and had the girth of a grain elevator. Frank strode toward the tree. The closer he got, the more he could feel its presence and its reach toward him. The grass he walked on somehow felt inexplicably connected to the tree, and in brushing his hand over the flowers as he passed them, he could feel the tree in each touch. It made no sense, but he knew it was true. It wasn't till he was a stone's throw from the tree he could make out its essence, and it struck him like a knife to the heart. He stopped dead in his tracks, eyes frozen wide like skeets, his breath stolen from within him. He could neither advance nor retreat. The tree swayed slightly, though there wasn't a hint of wind, as though to observe him. Gripped with fear, Frank continued to stare at the trunk of the tree, still unwilling to believe what he was seeing. Protruding from it, yet one with it, was the silhouetted effigy that he had seen in his nightmares long ago in Okinawa. The dark figure of unknown origin and nature, powerful and mighty, leaned towards him, fused to the tree. He could do no more than that. Just as Frank had seen in his visions, the entity was one with the tree, bare-chested with arms stretched across the trunk, as though crucified on it, yet not. He was not just with the tree, he was the tree, sharing life with it, sustaining it. The horror of the Okinawan nightmares returned to him in all their fierceness, yet, at the same time, this was not the nightmare. This was something different, a fulfillment of the nightmares, yet not their essence. And when the entity spoke to him, it confirmed this.
Don't be afraid.
The voice was deep and sonorous and majestic. Frank didn't so much respond as obey.
Come closer.
Frank stepped toward the tree till he could make out every line in the humanoid's face and see every vein that ran from the trunk into his arms.
Frank,
he said. His voice carried such magnanimity that Frank was fearful and comforted at the same time.
How did you know my name?
I've known you for a very long time.
Frank peered into the figure's eyes. They revealed much in their paradoxes. They were gentle yet powerful, ancient yet youthful, mystic yet simple, tragic yet consoling. Frank's fear left him completely as the figure spoke on in a warm, resonant voice.
I saw you in the gutter in Indonesia. I watched you work at Soncorp. I felt your pain in dealing with the military. I heard your screams in your first passage to the frozen wasteland. I know your deepest fears and greatest longings. I know everything about you.
Frank felt a tranquil mesmerizing as he listened, and when he thought he couldn't be any more amazed, the entity spoke again.
I know everything.
These 3 words seemed implausibly absurd, yet he believed them. The richness of the voice alone was convincing, but it was more than that. A spirit of authority came forth with the words, leaving Frank no doubt as to their truth. Yet Frank still had no idea who this was. He didn't have a clue as to his status, and despite the calm he exuded, Frank was still unaware if this figure was ultimately benign or malevolent. He asked,
"Are you God?"
The top rim of the sun set behind the earth supporting the great tree as Frank presented his question.
I don't know.
If you know everything, how could you not know?
I don't know. I just know that I don't know.
Frank thought about this.
Could you be God?
I'm afraid of the thought that I could be. Yet I don't want that burden. I suspect I am deity because I am all-knowing, but if it were possible, could God choose not to be God?
There was a faint rustle of discontentment from the surrounding bushes and shrubs as he said this. Some of the flowers closed.
I am what I am, and you are what you are, Frank.
What am I? Am I a Pillow?
You are more and less than that.
What is your name?
Don't ask my name.
Frank wondered for the life of him why not, but honored his request. The flowers and leaf buds seemed to reopen and shiver at this response.
How old are you?
I have no age. I've always been.
What is my age?
Older than you know, but still young.
Did you make my world?
I created your universe from nothing but only your universe.
Are there others like you?
There are others who appear like me to others.
Why are you here?
The rice fields on the edge of the omniverses provide shelter.
Shelter? Shelter from what? Shelter from whom?
Shelter from my identity.
This perplexed Frank and led him to a million other questions, but he suspected the answers would take him no closer to his most critical inquiries. His desperation to know who he was and why he had become like this returned to him as a roaring flame. The entity preempted him.
You want to know your purpose?
Yes, I do.
Sit at my base and lean against me.
Frank didn't hesitate to do so, yet moved slowly and respectfully. As he rested his back against the bark of the trunk, he felt immediately rested. It was as though a small bough were reaching inside of him and stroking his soul. Frank exhaled and softly lay his head back against the great tree, and for the first time in his adult life, Frank knew peace. He had known of peace and he had longed for peace, but he had never truly known it for himself, and it was beautiful. Beautiful. The entity continued to speak in his lush tones.
You must leave here, Frank.
This would have devastated Frank had he not been in the cradle of serenity, yet he failed to understand it at all. The figure spoke on.
Your purpose is not here, nor will you find your true identity here. Your identity is inexorably tied to your purpose and both lie beyond.
I'm scared to go on.
You must leave here.
He repeated with a tone of urgency.
Let nothing distract you or tempt you from this.
There is so much that is macabre and evil in other realms. And besides, I have no coordinates other than those given to me by higher powers, and they always lead me to unimaginable horror.
You're not trying hard enough.
If this were intended as comfort, it failed,
I don't understand.
said Frank, frustrated.
Try harder.
From anyone else, these words would have been torment, but from the entity they brought correction and hope.
With enough chromosomes, you can still discover just about any coordinates you like.
Frank's face fell at this.
Each time I begin to amass chromosomes, Chin Chin harvests them from me. I can't escape him.
The thought then came to Frank, and he didn't hesitate to ask.
Is Chin Chin God?
If Chin Chin were God, he wouldn't need your chromosomes.
Frank recalled hearing this somewhere before.
So he's a peace lord?
A very powerful one. But he's not your primary concern.
He's not.
Frank felt like a child talking to this figure.
Who's my primary concern?
At that moment, Frank sensed the answer that the entity wished to speak.
Yourself.
But those were not the words he delivered.
I will share with you a mystery, Frank. Listen carefully. You are unique. Your multiplying chromosomes are a gift. They have been given to you for a reason. The chromosomes are a gift. They have been given to you for a reason. The chromosomes are yours. A curse beyond anyone who takes them from you. But you must learn how to keep them. You must know how to hide them, veil them, possess them.
While still resting against the trunk of the tree, Frank turned to look into the entity's eyes. They were magnificent.
How?
He asked. The longer he spent in his presence, the more infantile he understood himself to be. He also felt supremely protected.
Translophony.
Frank looked up at him for an explanation.
Share your chromosomes with other entities and organisms. Chromosomes should never be taken, but they can freely given and returned. Chromosomes given through translephony remain the property of the giver. They are shared to sustain and stored to nurture others. But there is another quality it brings. It makes chromosomes untouchable to any who would endeavor to steal them.
Translophony?
Frank said in a soft daze.
Look around you. The trees and plants, the flowers and the grass, even the birds which have retired for the evening and feed off the plants, contain my chromosomes. I have given to all of them. I sustain this whole island. I can give and receive my chromosomes as I please. And this great tree,
He said, looking about him.
I have given of my chromosomes so greatly that we are now as one. We remain separate entities, yet we function as one.
Frank sat in silence for a long time, absorbing all this. The sky was now quite dark and its expanse was flooded with a starry host.
Can I use translophony?
Anyone with the gift, the purpose, and the focus can employ it. The first you have. The second is forming. The third comes with practice.
Frank placed his hand on the grass beside him. It was soft to touch, and he desired a connection with it. But he felt no more than that. He was tired after his long day, and in the calm of the island, he soon became sleepy. He moved away from the tree and lay down under its branches on a plush carpet of grass. Billows of peace rolled over and over him, and the last thing he remembered was running his hands backwards and forwards delicately over the tips of the blades and feeling them tickle his palms. Sleep came over him like a warm blanket. An almighty crash startled him awake in the pre-dawn light. He abruptly sat up and looked out, incredulous, over the hill, that great hill that had supported the indomitable tree and the entity that was one with it. There was nothing left of them but an enormous stump cut clean through. The tree had been felled and lay, with the wise and mighty humanoid, now cold and deceased, still attached, at the back of the hill, all broken limbs and wilting canopy. Beside the stump sat an enormous figure, dark and silent. It looked at Frank with a murderous gaze. Swollen, blood-red eyes bulged out from a huge emerald-colored triangular head. Its body was lean but muscular, and its limbs were hairy, impossibly long, and sat neatly folded in front of its torso. It reminded Frank of some of the enormous praying mantises from the Okinawa jungle. It rubbed its front appendages together in a slow, hypnotic rhythm before leaning toward Frank and opening its steely mouth with a hint of a smile.
Fear the Peace Lords,
It hissed.
for what we are more than powerful than anything you can possibly imagine.
Frank was on his knees, mortified with terror.
Oh, you.
The words quivered out.
My name is Diopatra. Remember it.
Frank nodded.
Remain here on this island
It continued.
until the Dark Lord comes again.
With that, it simply dissipated into thin air as though a hologram fading away. Frank remained motionless. After finally experiencing such long-awaited and sweet peace, to be crushed again and swept back into a universe of desolation and death was too much for him. He broke down and wept, inconsolably. When he lifted his head again, the sun had peeked over the new horizon and the Eastland was fluted with a strong but sad light. The flowers and leaf buds remained resolutely closed, and the grass had a ginger tinge to it. The trees all had a wilt to them, and not a bird's song could be heard anywhere on the island. Instinctively, he walked up, sat on the stump, and looked down over the backside of the hill. A thin rim of water separated the island from the mainland to the east, beyond which there lay he knew not what. And then the dilemma dawned on him. Did he listen to the unsettling words of the victorious Peace Lord who told him to stay? Or did he heed the pleasant advice of the defeated Peace Lord who told him to move beyond this place? It was surprisingly easy decision for him. Not because he trusted the latter, nor was it because he hated the former. It was primarily because he considered himself already a dead man, and with nothing to lose, he moved for whatever promised gain. He lifted himself from his seat, and with an air of listlessness, strolled down the hill toward the stream running in front of the mainland. He never noticed the tiniest of hypocotyls peeping up from the center of the stump. Neither did he see the lush, long grass which had grown around him as he slept. The stream separating the island from the mainland was narrower and faster flowing than it had appeared from a distance. It was also teeming with fish. Frank waded into the middle of it where it came up to his knees, splashing and washing about him. The fish, so near salmon they may as well have been, were literally jumping out of the water all about him. It was only a matter of time before a big one jumped right into his hands, which he caught with a sense of glee. He carried it back to the island, all flipping and wriggling to cook over a fire for breakfast. Yet by the time his feet were out of the water, the fish was little more than a withered lancet. His first inclination was to wonder what was wrong with the fish in this realm that they would perish so quickly out of water. He repeated the exercise and quickly caught another good-sized salmon, this time keeping it under the water till he got to the water's edge, but again by the time he lifted it from the swell, it was embryonic. He was about to dismiss the whole incident and move on, but the words of the tree entity returned to him. Was this translaphony? With the remains of the fish still in his hands, rather than taking from it, he consciously gave himself to it and was amazed to see before his eyes the fish restored to full and vibrant life. He tossed it back into the torrent and picked up the residue of the first creature. It too, with encouragement, returned to full constitution in his hands. Considering it, he took from it again, and it deteriorated right before him once more. Frank was intoxicated. He restored it to full health before throwing it full-bodied onto a hastily made fire and ate it with relish. With his belly full, he turned his back on the island, crossed the stream once again, and readied to venture deep into the rice fields of the eastern mainland. Before starting out, though, he made one more wade into the stream, grabbed one more leaping fish and sucked from it its life source, till there was nothing left of it but scales and bones. Giddy with pleasure, he discarded the remains on the ground and walked into the long, mature shoots. The day was still young when he started out. The rice fields stretched before him in an endless run of green. The constant bleat of crickets rang like tinnitus in his ears. Distant hills broke the visual monotony, but there were no impediments to keep him from making good progress. These eastern paddies seemed devoid of any advanced life forms. Certainly, he faced no opposition as he walked. He was pleased to be free of torment, yet as the sun slowly crawled its way up the pale blue sky, it came to him anyway. Its name was loneliness. As field after field passed beneath his feet, he felt the tiresomeness of continuing on his own to a place of no consequence and a time without meaning. His friends, Salamander Man and Pink Guy, Alpha Centurion and Drone, and Negi Generation 1. He recalled all their adventures, the laughter and the fighting that only brotherhood could foster, how he longed for their company again, and the loss of the tree entity only served to exacerbate the forlornness he was feeling, the sagely words he spoke, the deep peace he afforded. Yet he recalled the words which had been spoken to him.
You must leave here.
The words had been spoken with such potency.
Your purpose is not here.
This resonated deeply with Frank. Though he had no idea where he was going, these words put a spring in his step.
You're not trying hard enough.
This confuses Frank. He had no idea where to move on to, even if he did. He didn't have the coordinates to get there. Frank found this deeply troubling, yet he somehow knew that the entity had spoken the truth. He needed to try harder, but he was at a complete loss as to how. The torment of frustration he felt was soon surpassed by that of loneliness, which returned to him with a disturbing intensity. With each passing field, his desire for companionship increased. The higher the sun rose, the greater the desire he felt for fellowship with his old comrades. And the crickets kept singing their throbbing songs. By the time the heat of the day was not at its most sapping, the sun seemed to pause directly above him, and, growing delirious, he began to talk, firstly to himself, then to Pink Guy and Salamander Man, as though they were walking right there by him.
What say you, big guy? Are we right for direction?
Keep going, Captain. We're surely on the right path.
Can you concur, Salamander Man?
Yes!
Came the answer, confirmed with the playing of a very merry tune.
I do believe, gentlemen, that we shall arrive safely by nightfall. Now, Pink Guy, would you be so kind to advise of the life forms that we should expect along the way? Friend or foe, don't hold back, my brother. I want to know them all.
This conversation continued for many hours, possibly days, when Frank suddenly stopped dead and stared at an apparition off in the middle distance. There, on the far side of the field they had just entered, stood a thatch hut, and in front of it, motionless and halting, a humanoid figure. His first understanding was to think it was another of the soulless bodies he had encountered on the west side of the island. Yet, as he drew nearer, he could see that the figure was very much alive, in full health, and was female. Young and vivacious, she raised a hand and gestured with enthusiasm for him to come and join her. He turned to raise eyebrows with his companions, but they were no longer with him. Frank marched through the sheaths with a fresh vigor to see a woman of stunning organic beauty standing before him. She had an earthly Mediterranean complexion, with long dark hair, gently woven, lying over her left shoulder. She wore a sleeveless, cream-colored garment, secured at the waist with a thin brown belt. She was barefoot.
I'm so glad you came.
She said, bearing a huge white smile.
So glad.
She took him by the hand and led him into the hut. It was noticeably cooler inside. The interior was simply furnished with a small wooden dining table, 2 chairs, a short counter, and sink against the nearer wall that served as a kitchen, a small primitive bathroom, and a narrow bed that lay neatly made against the further wall. She sat down and brought him a cool drink.
You must be so tired. You have come a long way. Drink up, rest well.
She squatted down to remove his shoes and brought a tub of soapy water over to wash his feet. Frank had no idea who this was or why he should be the recipient of such kindness, but he was far too tired to object. Her hands were soft and gentle, and as she washed his soles and caressed his toes, Frank was instantly healed of any previous torments. She looked up at him with enormous brown eyes, friendly and inviting, and smiled again. Frank couldn't help but notice the very fine and ample cleavage that was revealed, only fractionally, but enough, and, simple folk that he was enamored.
What's your name?
She asked. He returned his vision to her eyes.
Frank.
Frank.
She repeated softly with another smile.
I like that name. It's a good name.
She gently wrung the water from the cloth.
What's your name?
Gomba.
What are you doing all the way out here on your own?
Waiting for you, of course. I knew someone would come eventually.
She began to towel his feet.
I'm just glad it was you.
She removed the tub of water, washed her hands, and joined him at the table with a plate of freshly baked rice cakes. He wasted no time in devouring them, and she watched him do so with pleasure. She joined him, and they ate in silence for a while before she spoke again.
What are you doing here?
Frank waited before responding.
That's a very long story.
He ate another rice cake.
How about you?
She smiled again.
That's a very long story.
They looked into each other's eyes, yet Frank couldn't discern whether hers was a knowing look or one of avoidance.
Maybe we should be looking ahead rather than to the past.
When he had eaten and drunk his fill, she took him by both hands and laid him down on the bed. She left him for a moment before returning with a cool, damp cloth, which she folded and rested on his heated brow. He felt the sweetness of relief. She knelt by the bed, placed his elbow in the palm of her left hand, and gently began to tickle his palm with the fingers of her right. Frank closed his eyes and received the gift. Tenderly, she stroked his bare arm. She was unhurried in her devotion, and he was wholly compliant. Occasionally, she stopped tickling his arm to touch and stroke his face and neck before returning to his arms again. Frank was entranced. Slowly, she leaned over him and drew near, and then kissed him on the mouth with the long and tender kiss of a true lover. He was all hers, and he couldn't have been more grateful for it. She softly cupped his cheeks in her hands and kissed him all over his face. Frank never opened his eyes.
Stay with me.
He whispered.
I think I could be persuaded to do that.
Frank returned.
Stay with me forever.
You must leave here.
He heard a voice bellow. Frank promptly sat up, startled and afraid.
What's up?
She asked, surprised.
Did you hear that?
What? You must be very tired. You're hearing things.
Frank immediately jumped up and went outside to see if anyone was there. Except for the sound of the crickets, the rice fields were eerily still. He circled the hut, but there was no sign of anyone.
What, Frank?
She asked, taking his hand leading him back to the hut.
What's the matter?
Frank had no answer.
Everything's fine?
She said. She cupped his face again.
Come back in and stay with me?
I have to go.
Frank said resolutely.
What?
I have to go.
Frank was robotic in his delivery.
You just got here. I've been waiting for you. I want you to stay with me.
He looked out over the fields.
No, I have to leave this place.
No, you have to stay.
I have to leave.
You don't understand. You have to stay.
She grabbed him by the wrists and pulled him towards her.
You have no choice.
Her voice dropped a whole octave as she said this. He looked deeply into her eyes and saw flecks of blood appear in her whites.
Release me. My purpose is not here.
With that, her eyes went blood red from corner to corner. Her head tilted back aggressively with a loud crack, and her mouth opened to preposterous proportions. Frank felt an intense heat radiate from her, and then starting from her crown, her skin began to melt off and fall in daubs to the ground. He leapt back horrified, watching the flesh fall away, and a whole new creature emerge. A green so dark it was almost black, an antennaed helmet for a head, the face of a mollusk, and the body of a woodlouse on steroids. It stood before him, almost twice the size of her previous incarnation, heaving and retching from the transformation. As though stuck in a morph mode, it continued to produce flesh in random patches, which immediately melted and dropped to the ground. The creature threw its head back and let out a piercing, ugly wail that rang out over the rice fields and silenced the crickets for miles around.
You have to stay.
It managed to utter between a collection of clicks and crunches. Elocution was clearly not its strong point.
The Dark Lord commands it.
An enormous piece of flesh grew from its nose and hung there, swaying as the creature twitched till it finally hit the ground with a solid splat. Frank's heart was racing, and it generated within him a fresh vitality and a tremendous sense of valor. He took a step toward the beast.
I will laze.
The great crustacean threw its back again and released another almighty roar which rattled the posts of the hut, yet it seemed unwilling to physically engage Frank. He continued to observe the beast. It then made a short, high-pitched squeal, a shrill bust of gas accompanied by a shiver.
What was that?
Allergies from the rice fields, Liaoning, Jiangsu, Guangdong. They're all here. I hate it. I really do. I hate these rice fields.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Frank said in a voice approaching sympathy.
Yeah.
It seemed to appreciate Frank's concern before returning to a more menacing posture.
I still have to violently incapacitate you. You know, it's my only escape from this wretched regions.
After a series of threatening gestures and sounds, which at first intimidated Frank, but soon almost amused him, it remained at a standoff.
You two pillars are all the same, all roar and no bite.
He grabbed a chair and stepped once more toward the creature.
Find this.
He said and rammed the chair into its face, knocking it to the ground with a huge thud. Pinned to the ground on its back, its multitude of disproportionately puny legs began to scuttle in the air.
You tell your lord that I've left if you can.
With that, Frank placed his hand firmly on the creature's thorax and took from him just as he had taken from the salmon. At first, nothing appeared to happen, and the giant bug wrestled and screamed with hardiness. Frank kept his hand firmly in place, and suddenly the creature was stilled. Then, after a pause, it began to struggle again, but this time as in the throes of reduction. Noticeably, it began to wither. It made a few more gagging sounds before it was permanently silenced and continued to decompose under Frank's grip. By the time it was done, Frank was a roaring powerhouse of energy, and the creature was little more than ashes and dust on the edge of the rice field. He looked out over the rice fields.
I can't believe I was about to have sex with an insect.
Standing over the remains like an undisputed champion, his thoughts were curiously torn between his own dynamism and his desire to see his old friend Salamander Man again. Delivering one departing roar to what was left of the creature, Frank found himself yelling a series of coordinates to the sky. Though new to him, he recognized the series of letters and numbers for what they were. He grabbed a blade from the kitchen, moved out into the center of one of the rice fields, and sliced the base of his thumb. Having created a circle of blood in the middle of the field, he lay down and yelled the coordinates into the air. As he did, he could feel himself submerging into the mud of the rice fields. The mire encased him, covering his legs and arms, swallowing his shoulders and hips. entering his ears, and finally, his eyes. Far from the terror and fear that accompanied previous transports, this was strangely satisfying. He almost enjoyed it. The last thing he saw was the rice plants reaching high above him into the pleasant blue sky. When he was completely submerged and could resist no longer, he opened his mouth and took the soggy soil fully into his lungs. With that, he left the rice fields.